I'm here today to talk about an innovative idea to drive cures using philanthropy. The approach is dedicated to the 1.8 million Americans and the many millions more around the world living with type 1 diabetes, or T1D for short. I'm not a doctor or a scientist. I'm speaking to you today simply as a parent. Our 21-year-old son Finn was diagnosed with type 1 diabetes when he was just 2 years old. Since that day, in October 2002, he has relied on constant infusions or injections of insulin to keep him alive, part of a delicate balancing act with blood sugar that occupies a part of every hour of every day. The diagnosis was life-changing for him and for our family, which, like hundreds of thousands of other families, battle for a cure, inspired by the courage and the fight that we see in our loved ones every day to overcome the obstacles this disease throws at them. I'd like to talk today about a small group of philanthropically minded families, motivated by love and a thirst for risk and disruption in the fight to cure T1D. The group of us took a leap of faith together to back a disciplined, business-oriented approach that I think has reimagined the role of philanthropy in the translation of science to commercialization. In 2016, this small group started a movement that has transformed our fight. As I'll describe to you, T1D had historically lacked meaningful commercial cure investment, despite a lot of research that suggests it is curable. In the last 6 years, a vehicle that we created called the T1D Fund has changed all of that, catalyzing over $600 million of private investment in biotech companies working on T1D. You will not hear a victory lap today. T1D is not cured. And actually, I think we probably have a lot more work in front of us than behind us. But my hope is that activists and philanthropists working on other diseases might find something interesting in what we're doing. I think it's always a good idea to compare notes about how to make philanthropy more effective and impactful, particularly in disease, which ultimately affects all families. T1D is different from type 2 diabetes. But you've almost certainly heard a lot more about type 2s because they outnumber T1Ds 20 to 1 in America. Unlike type 2 diabetes, T1D is an autoimmune disease. It's actually one of the most prevalent autoimmune diseases in the world. In many ways, it's the scientific cousin of diseases like rheumatoid arthritis, lupus, and MS. In T1D, the body attacks and kills the cells in the pancreas that produce insulin. That's the hormone that converts blood sugar into energy to keep us alive. T1Ds have to artificially balance insulin and blood sugar 24/7 using a combination of blood tests and shots, monitors, and insulin pumps. Blood sugar is affected by literally everything we do. Everything we eat and drink, every jolt of adrenaline, every virus, all of our exercise. Abnormal blood sugars affect our physical and our mental performance, our focus, our resiliency, and ultimately, health outcomes. Rapid changes in blood sugar feel horrible, or so I'm told. Those of us without T1D have literally no idea what it feels like. The discovery of insulin 100 years ago changed T1D from a death sentence to a maintenance disease, and medical devices have made the disease easier to manage. But even for them, the burden of this disease is constant and wearing, with daily risks of dangerously low blood sugars and real long-term risks of complications, including nerve damage, blindness, heart and kidney disease that can and do take lives. A huge portion of people living with T1D, especially in minority and poor communities and in developing nations around the world, have blood sugar levels that are so out of control that the odds of these bad consequences happening are simply unacceptable. And get this, in the United States, roughly half of people living with T1D do not even see the relevant specialist, an endocrinologist. And so, while all of us in the T1D community are grateful that vials of insulin like this one keep our loved ones alive, all of us also think it's a pretty lousy answer to rely on a 100-year-old drug to treat this disease, particularly in an age of great innovation in cell therapies, gene therapies, and immune therapies. In 2015, a small group of us got together to think about how to innovate in type 1 diabetes. we started by zooming out to look at the big picture. The life sciences space is a complicated mosaic of different participants, every one of which has to be involved in order for life-changing cures to be delivered. We thought what we'd do is assess, like, how is the T1D mosaic, how is the life sciences mosaic working in T1D? The answer is it sort of was, but mostly wasn't. On one side of the mosaic are governments, public charities and private foundations, and academic research institutions. These offer grants for the basic research that is the essential building blocks of scientific discovery. Binding them together are usually patient groups and advocates. In T1D, these pieces were productive, they were passionate, and they were funded, led by JDRF, the charity that we're associated with, and the Helmsley Charitable Trust, among others. On the other side of the mosaic are regulators that approve drugs, mid-sized, massive pharmaceutical companies, health insurers, and the many commercial organizations that surround them. On first glance, these two seemed pretty focused on T1D, but on a closer look, they were focused almost exclusively on treating the disease with insulin and devices, a big red flag for us. In the middle of a functioning disease mosaic are small biotech companies, usually funded by specialized life sciences investment firms loaded with experts. These small biotech companies prime the pump for cures, taking binary bets on usually very, very early commercial concepts, bets that the pharma companies aren't really ready to take. And what we found was that at that time, the largest investment in a biotech company working on curing T1D was just over $40 million. And the numbers got really small after that. Essentially, life science investors and biotech companies weren't working on curing T1D. Well, we had found our mission, because unless these commercial players started exploring cures for T1D, we were literally whistling in the wind. We had found our target for impact philanthropy. We would build a vehicle to bring them in, and we would ask the T1D community to back it financially. We aren't life sciences experts, and sometimes I wonder if just being a step removed and having that perspective let us see how the status quo wasn't working. But either way, at that point, we had the clarity and the conviction of what we had to do in order to bring people together. Our idea was to create a professionally managed investment fund, not to cure T1D, but to convince biotech companies, their venture capital backers, and ultimately the entire pharmaceutical industry that they had to take leadership of this problem. Basically, we needed to expand the size of the army fighting T1D. Curing this disease was going to be a billions of dollar problem, not a millions of dollar problem. And so, core to our basic idea was a humble recognition that our charitable contributions were always just going to be a drop in the bucket of the resources needed for a cure. Our vision, then and now, is that charities lead in research and patient advocacy, but it's companies that lead the mega-dollar last-mile efforts to deliver products to patients. We thought that we saw a new role for impact philanthropists, which was to convince them to join us and then help them do it. As part of JDRF, which is the largest charity focused on T1D, and a global network around it, we had access to amazing research, to great to research, to amazing know-how, and we thought, gosh, what if we could use those resources to catalyze a market? We knew we were a phone call away from anyone on planet Earth who knew something relevant about the science of the disease, and we thought we could make this mosaic work better. We could hire investors to have them explain to other investors and to companies how this disease works and what the opportunity was in it. And we could figure out how to get this array of resources to make it seem less risky for them to jump into the pool with us. Well, because this was our special sauce, the fund needed to be a nonprofit. Basically, we were going to raise money from donors. We would invest that money in companies that were interested in working in T1D. And then here's the big part. we would convince private investors to invest at least 5 times more than we did into these companies, which then we in turn would help develop their T1D cure programs. If the fund made any money off of these investments, we would roll it right back into the fund so we could invest it in other exciting companies going to cure this disease. JDRF leadership endorsed the idea and gave us some vital seed capital and support. Since 2016, just over 100 families, all of them are directly affected by T1D, have donated more than $100 million to the T1D fund. The fund is now one of the largest venture philanthropy funds in disease. Right out of the gate, we were able to hire a dedicated and really talented investment staff. About 24 of those life sciences investment firms that I referred to before, that have never worked in T1D before, have now invested the roughly $600 million I referred to at the beginning. We have 20 companies with active T1D cure programs in immune therapies, cell therapies, and gene therapies. Obviously, just a massive change from several years ago. And because we recognize the overlaps among T1D and other autoimmune diseases, about 2/3 of our companies are working on T1D and at least one other disease. And that's an amazing force multiplier because it's attracted literally hundreds of executives, researchers, scientists, drug developers, and investors into the T1D fight. Progress in cure therapeutics is slow, but we're hopeful. All of our companies, other than 2, are really, really early. This is preclinical stuff in phase 1, but that's okay. An investment market that didn't exist before and that has to exist in order for a cure to happen is now alive. It's starting to thrive. I can tell that people are thinking about risk and opportunity in T1D differently than they were before, and I am certain that the connective tissue that didn't exist in the T1D mosaic before is working, and it's starting to thrive. We are far from finished, though. And we have at least one big mountain to climb, and that is to convince the major pharmaceutical companies and the health insurance companies that it's in their economic interest to cure type 1 diabetes. So we'll go through the same exercise again. Why aren't they buying? What do we have to do to convince them to change their mind? And then how can we help them? For those of you listening who are maybe working on other diseases, I'd offer 3 observations of what we've learned over the past 6 years. First, finding cures and therapies requires really ambitious, but disciplined and business-oriented philanthropic strategies. All too often, disease charity relies on slogans and emotion. But in our healthcare system, products only get delivered to patients if there's an economic case to be made. Basic research will always be essential, but moving beyond research requires an assessment of how it can make sense for private investors and pharmaceutical companies to invest the billions of dollars required for a cure. I think that there's a big role for impact philanthropists here. I think they can make a big difference if they're willing to go on the same playing field as the companies making the decisions. Second, despite these great ambitions, philanthropies and charities need to calibrate those against what philanthropy can and cannot accomplish. Accept and embrace the reality that companies and insurers will drive commercialization. People often ask me, well, why wouldn't you just make the T1D fund 2, 3, 4 times bigger? Well, the answer is it just wouldn't move the needle. Instead, we focus relentlessly on catalyzing, accelerating, and guiding this new market, accepting industry leadership, and standing ready to serve and help them in any way that we can. Our unique value comes in delivering knowledge and network that no one else in the world can bring. Finally, do not underestimate the power of committed families in common cause. I think the real reason the fund is working so far is that the group of us shared a conviction of why the status quo wasn't working and what we had to do about it. And we decided together we were going to take risks, stay disciplined, and figure it out. We're going to. Please stay tuned.